In the spring of 1879, a contract crew working the oak stands near the Leicestershire border filed a report with their supervisor explaining why sections of planned timber work had been left incomplete. The language used was procedural. Tools had been gathered early. Several cutting sites had been abandoned mid-task. The reason given was brief and matter-of-fact. The men had encountered something in the woods that made continued work inadvisable. Forest labor in that period was organized and methodical. Crews were hired seasonally to fell timber, coppice hazel and ash, and manage charcoal burning operations that supplied fuel to nearby ironworks and settlements. These were not casual workers. Many had spent years in the trade. They understood how to read terrain, judge the integrity of a tree before the saw touched bark, and navigate dense growth in poor light. They were accustomed to isolation, long days, and the physical risks that came with the profession. The report was not framed as a complaint. It was an explanation for interrupted productivity. The crew foreman noted that the decision to halt work had been collective, not imposed by a single nervous individual. No injuries had occurred. No equipment had been lost. But the work had stopped, and the men had relocated their camp to a different parcel of forest more than a mile away. What made the report unusual was not its tone, which remained flat and professional, but the fact that it existed at all. Forestry crews of that era were expected to manage their own problems. Weather, difficult ground, and the occasional aggressive animal were handled without formal documentation. Logging a disruption in writing suggested something that could not be easily categorized or dismissed. The supervisor accepted the report without recorded comment. The abandoned cutting sites were removed from the seasonal work schedule. No replacement crew was sent. The loss in timber yield was absorbed quietly, and the contract adjusted to reflect the reduced output. In practical terms, this meant the woods in question were left unworked for the remainder of that year, and, according to later records, for several years beyond. There was no official investigation. No formal inquiry was opened into what the crew had encountered. The report itself was filed alongside other routine documents related to timber contracts, land surveys, and resource management. It remained there, unremarkable in appearance, until researchers examining labor records from the period noticed the gap in expected yields and traced it back to that single unexplained interruption in the spring of 1879. What the report did not include was detail. It did not describe what had been seen or heard. It did not provide the names of the men involved or specify which groves had been abandoned. It offered no speculation and made no appeal for reassignment or compensation. It simply stated that work had ceased and would not resume in that location. The absence of elaboration was itself significant. Experienced workers knew how to communicate risk. If the problem had been a damaged access road, an unstable hillside, or a territorial landowner, the report would have said so. The vagueness suggested something the foreman either could not articulate clearly or chose not to commit to paper. The woods where the crew had been working were not remote. They bordered established paths and lay within a day's travel of multiple villages. They had been harvested before. There was no geographic or logistical reason to avoid them. Yet after the spring of 1879, they were quietly removed from active use, and the men who had worked there did not return. The men who worked the Leicestershire forests in the late 1870s followed patterns refined over generations. Timber work was seasonal but predictable. Crews arrived in early spring when the ground firmed and sap began to rise. They remained through summer, cutting oak for shipbuilding and construction, hazel for fencing, and ash for tool handles. Charcoal burners worked year-round, tending slow fires in earthen kilns that turned hardwood into fuel. Every task had its rhythm, and every man knew his place within it. Work began at first light. Axes and two-man crosscut saws were the primary tools. Felling a mature oak required coordination, physical endurance, and constant attention to wind, lean, and the distribution of weight in the crown. A tree could shift unexpectedly. Limbs under tension could snap back with enough force to crack bone. Men learned to read these dangers through sound and vibration, through the feel of the saw blade binding or running free, through the creak of wood beginning to fail. The forest itself was not silent. It was filled with the repetitive thunk of axes biting into heartwood, the rhythmic rasp of saws, the calls men used to signal a fall or warn of movement in the canopy. Birds responded to human presence with alarm calls or by moving to safer perches. Squirrels and foxes observed from a distance. Deer moved through the understory at dawn and dusk, audible long before they were visible. All of this was familiar. It formed a backdrop the workers understood and largely ignored. Danger was expected, but it came from known sources. A misjudged cut could send a tree falling in the wrong direction. A widowmaker, a dead limb caught high in the canopy, could drop without warning. Wasps nested in hollow trunks. Adders sunned themselves on warm stones near streams. Heavy rain made slopes unstable. Winter brought cold that could stiffen hands until a tool slipped. These were risks men accounted for in how they worked, where they stepped, and how they positioned themselves relative to one another. Fear was not part of the routine. Caution was. There was a difference. Caution kept you aware of your surroundings, attentive to signs of instability or threat. Fear was a distraction, something that made you hesitate or move carelessly. Experienced workers did not fear the woods. They respected the work and understood its costs, but they did not walk into the trees each morning expecting something incomprehensible. Sightlines mattered. Crews preferred to work in areas where they could see one another, where calls could be heard clearly, and where movement through the undergrowth was straightforward. Dense thickets were avoided not out of superstition but practicality. If a man was injured, you needed to reach him quickly. If a tree began to fall wrong, you needed space to move. Visibility and open ground were professional preferences, not emotional ones. Camps were established near water sources on level ground away from steep drops or areas prone to flooding. Fires were built each evening for cooking and warmth. Tools were cleaned, sharpened, and stored carefully. Clothing and boots were dried. The routine was efficient and unremarkable. Men spoke little during meals, tired from the day's work. Conversation, when it occurred, centered on practical matters. Which sections were nearly cleared? Where the next cutting would take place? Whether the weather would hold? The forest at night was darker and noisier than during the day. Wind moved through the canopy in waves. Branches rubbed and creaked. Small animals rustled through leaf litter. Owls called. These sounds were constant and expected. Men slept through them without difficulty. Anything unusual, a larger animal moving close to camp or the crack of a falling branch, would wake the lightest sleepers, but such interruptions were rare and easily explained. This was the order of things. It had been the order of things for as long as anyone working those woods could remember. The forest was a place of labor, not mystery. It provided resources and demanded effort in return. That understanding shaped how men moved through it, how they spoke about it, and how they responded when something in that order began to shift. The first disruptions were not dramatic. They were absences. Sounds that should have been present were missing, and the silence arrived without warning or apparent cause. It began in late April. A crew working a stand of mature oaks reported that birdsong had stopped abruptly mid-morning. This was not the gradual quieting that accompanied a passing hawk or the approach of a storm. The woods had been full of sound, then entirely still, as if something had drawn a curtain across the noise. The men continued working, but the silence persisted. No rustling in the canopy. No movement in the undergrowth. Even the sound of their own axes seemed muted, swallowed by the air itself. The quiet lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Then, just as suddenly, it lifted. Birds resumed calling. A squirrel chattered from a high branch. The forest returned to its usual state. The men discussed it briefly, attributed it to nothing in particular, and moved on. But it happened again. Different crew, different section of the woods, same unnatural stillness. This time it occurred in the early afternoon, during a period when the forest was typically at its most active. The men noticed it because they had been listening for the sound of another crew working a few hundred yards east. The distant rhythm of axes had been audible all morning. Then it vanished. Not faded, vanished. And with it, every other sound. One of the workers later described the experience as feeling enclosed. Not by trees or terrain, but by the silence itself. He said it pressed in from all sides, and that he became acutely aware of his own breathing, his own heartbeat, in a way that felt intrusive. He did not stop working, but he found himself glancing over his shoulder more frequently, scanning the spaces between the trees for movement or shape. The pattern repeated across multiple sites over the course of 2 weeks. Crews reported the same phenomenon: sudden silence, no clear trigger, a feeling of pressure or presence that could not be easily explained. The duration varied, but the quality of the silence was always the same: total, oppressive, wrong. Men who had spent years in the woods began to feel uncertain in spaces they knew well. Familiar groves took on a different character. The silence made distances harder to judge. Echoes behaved strangely. A shout that should have carried clearly would fall flat, absorbed before it traveled more than a few yards. Other times, sounds seemed to originate from the wrong direction, as though the forest were folding back on itself. No one could identify a source. There were no unusual weather patterns, no recent disturbances to the land, no evidence of predators large enough to cause such widespread alarm among the animal population. The silence simply appeared, occupied the space for a time, and then withdrew. The men did not speak about it openly at first. Each crew assumed the experience was isolated, a coincidence or a misperception. But during an evening when 2 crews shared a camp, the subject came up indirectly. One man mentioned that the birds had been acting strangely. Another agreed. A third described the silence in detail, and the others listened without interruption. By the end of the conversation, it was clear that what had seemed like isolated incidents were part of a broader pattern. This realization did not bring relief. It brought a new kind of unease. If the silence was affecting multiple sites across a wide area, then it was not random. It was consistent. And if it was consistent, then it suggested intention, or at least a presence capable of imposing itself on the environment in a way no natural animal could. The woods had become unreliable, and the men working within them had begun to notice. No formal meetings were held. No orders were issued. But over the course of the following week, crews across the forest belt began altering their routines in nearly identical ways. The changes were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as individual preference, but the consistency suggested something deeper. Men were responding to the same unspoken pressure. Certain groves were avoided, not abandoned outright, but deprioritized. A crew scheduled to clear a section of dense hazel near a steep hollow would arrive at the site, assess the ground, and decide to work a different area instead. The reasons given were practical: poor access, uncertain footing, better timber available elsewhere. But the same groves were passed over by multiple crews, and the explanations, while varied, never quite justified the choice. Workdays grew shorter. Crews that had routinely stayed in the woods until dusk began packing tools an hour earlier. Then, too, foremen did not object. The men moved with purpose when leaving, gathering equipment quickly, maintaining conversation as they walked back toward the camps. It was not panic, it was haste. A shared desire to be clear of the trees before the light failed completely. Fires at the camps burned larger and later into the night. Men who had previously been content to let the flames die down after the evening meal now kept them fed with fresh wood. The fires were not built for warmth. The nights were mild. They were built for light, and for the boundary that light created between the camp and the surrounding darkness. No one said this directly, but the effort put into maintaining the fires made the intention clear. Conversations changed as well. There was less talk about the next day's work and more focus on the present. What had been accomplished? What needed repair? Practical concerns that kept attention fixed on the immediate and the tangible. When the subject of the woods came up, it was discussed in terms of terrain and difficulty, never in terms of what might be waiting there. The silence from earlier in the month was not mentioned. Neither were the groves that had been quietly removed from rotation. This collective restraint was deliberate. The men were choosing not to name what they were feeling, not because they doubted it, but because naming it would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would demand a response. As long as the unease remained unspoken, it could be managed through adjusted routines and unobtrusive caution. Once it was made explicit, decisions would have to be justified, and justifications would require explanations no one was prepared to give. Trust within the crews deepened during this period, but it was a grim kind of trust. Men relied on one another to recognize the same signs, to respond in the same ways, without needing to discuss why. If one man suggested moving to a different site, the others agreed without question. If someone kept his axe closer to hand than usual, no one remarked on it. The absence of discussion became a form of communication in itself. The forest, meanwhile, remained unchanged. Trees grew, birds nested. The undergrowth thickened as spring gave way to early summer. The work continued, slower than planned, more cautious but uninterrupted. From a distance, everything appeared normal. But the men working within the trees knew otherwise. They had begun to operate according to rules they had not consciously created, rules that existed only in the space between observation and action. They were avoiding something. They had not yet decided what, but the avoidance was absolute, and it was shared, and it shaped every choice they made from the moment they entered the woods until the moment they left. The forest had not driven them out, but it had changed the terms of their presence. And the men had accepted those terms without ever speaking them aloud. The name came up during a night when two older men from separate crews were sharing a fire at the edge of a shared camp. Both had worked the Leicestershire forests for more than 20 years. Both had been quiet throughout the evening meal. The conversation had drifted toward old cutting sites, sections of the woods that had been productive in previous seasons but were no longer in active rotation. One of the men mentioned a hollow near a stand of ancient oaks, a place he remembered for the quality of the timber. He said he would not go back there now. The other man nodded slowly and said he knew the place. Then, after a pause, he said the name, Black Annie's. He did not explain it. He did not elaborate. He simply offered it as though it were sufficient, and the first man accepted it in the same way. There was no discussion of what the name meant or where it had come from. It was presented as fact, not folklore. A thing understood rather than believed. Others around the fire heard the name but did not ask about it. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition. Some of the younger men had heard the name before, mentioned in passing by older workers or locals who lived near the forest. It was always spoken quietly, often with a glance toward the trees, and never with the embellishment or dramatic tone that accompanied a ghost story. It was delivered as a warning, practical and direct, the way you might warn someone about an unstable bridge or a contaminated well. The older man continued. He said Black Annie's kept to certain places, deep hollows, old oaks with exposed roots, pits where the ground had collapsed into underlying limestone. He said she was not seen often, but when she was, it was always near those places. He did not describe her appearance. He did not need to. The name carried its own weight. He said the smartest thing a man could do was stay clear of the areas she favored. He said this without irony or hesitation. It was advice, not superstition. The conversation moved on, but the name remained. Over the following nights, it surfaced again in other camps, always spoken by older workers, always in the same measured tone. There was no effort to convince anyone of anything. The name was simply passed along the way information about dangerous terrain or unreliable employers might be shared. If you were new to the area, you learned it. If you had been there long enough, you already knew. What struck the younger men was the certainty with which the name was used. These were workers who dismissed most local stories as exaggeration or misdirection. They had no patience for superstition that interfered with practical labor. But they did not dismiss this. They listened. And when they returned to the woods the next day, they found themselves paying closer attention to the landscape, noting which areas matched the descriptions they had heard. Hollows, old oaks, collapsed ground. They did not avoid these places because they believed in the name. They avoided them because men they respected had told them to. The name was not an explanation. It was a marker, a way of identifying something without having to describe it in full. It allowed the men to communicate risk without exposing themselves to ridicule or doubt, and it became part of the vocabulary of the forest, used sparingly, but always understood. Black Annie's. The name used only after dark, the warning that required no further detail. The first physical evidence appeared in early May. A crew working near a limestone hollow found impressions in the soft ground surrounding the site. The marks were deep, irregular, and concentrated around the base of an old oak, whose roots had broken through the surface like exposed bone. The impressions were not hoof prints or paw prints. They were elongated, pressed into the mud with enough force to displace the soil and ridges around the edges. One of the men crouched to examine them more closely. The shape suggested something with long, narrow extremities, possibly fingers or claws, but the size was wrong. Each mark was nearly a foot in length, far larger than a human hand, and spaced in a way that suggested a wide, reaching gait. There were no clear tracks leading to or from the site, just the impressions themselves, clustered in a rough circle around the tree, as though something had been crouching there for an extended period. The crew did not disturb the site. They marked the location mentally and moved their work to a different section of the woods. When they mentioned the findings to their foreman later that evening, he listened without comment and made a note in his log. The site was removed from the cutting schedule. No explanation was provided. A week later, another crew reported similar marks near a collapsed pit further north. This time, the impressions were accompanied by deep scratches in the bark of several surrounding trees. The scratches were vertical, running from a height of 7 or 8 feet down to the base of the trunk. The bark had been gouged away in long strips, exposing the pale wood beneath. The depth and length of the marks suggested something large and strong, but the height at which they began ruled out any known animal in the region. Bears had not been seen in the area for generations. Wolves were long extinct. Deer did not scratch bark in that manner. The crew examined the scratches carefully. The gouges were clean, not ragged, as though whatever had made them had moved with deliberate pressure rather than frantic clawing. One man suggested it might have been a tool, something metal dragged across the bark, but there was no reason for anyone to do that, and no evidence of human activity in the immediate area. The scratches were fresh, the exposed wood still light in color, indicating they had been made within the past few days. Tools began to go missing, or rather, they began to appear in places where no one recalled leaving them. An axe left leaning against a stump would be found 20 yards away, resting upright against a different tree. A saw placed carefully on a flat stone would turn up half buried in leaf litter, the blade dulled as though it had been dragged across the ground. The displacements were not random. The tools were always found near hollows or old oaks, the same locations the men had been quietly avoiding. No one accused anyone of moving the tools deliberately. The crews were small, and the men knew one another well enough to recognize when something felt wrong. The tools were not being stolen or hidden as a prank. They were being relocated in a way that suggested observation, as though something were learning the routines of the camp, noting where objects were placed and moving them to demonstrate awareness. The men responded by keeping their tools closer. Axes and saws that would normally be left at the worksite overnight were now carried back to camp each evening. Equipment was accounted for before the crew left the trees, and again when they returned in the morning. This added time to the routine, but no one objected. The alternative, arriving at a site to find tools moved or missing, carried a discomfort that outweighed the inconvenience. Tracks and marks continued to appear throughout May. They were found near water sources, along game trails, and always in proximity to the older, deeper parts of the forest. The impressions never formed a clear or continuous path. They appeared in clusters, as though whatever made them moved in short bursts or remained stationary for long periods between movements. The scratches on the trees grew more numerous, always at the same unnatural height, always in the same vertical pattern. The men stopped investigating these signs. They noted them, reported them when necessary, and moved on. Curiosity gave way to caution. The marks were evidence of something present, something large, something capable of reaching and moving in ways that did not match any creature they recognized. And because they could not explain the marks, they chose instead to respect the boundaries those marks seemed to establish. The woods were no longer empty. The men had known that for weeks. But now the presence had left proof, and proof demanded acknowledgement, even if that acknowledgement remained silent. The sighting occurred on a gray afternoon in the third week of May. Two men were working a section of hazel coppice near the edge of a steep hollow, an area they had planned to avoid but had been forced to enter due to rescheduling. The light was flat and colorless, filtered through a heavy cloud cover that had settled over the forest since midday. Visibility was good, but the lack of shadows made depth difficult to judge. They had been working for about 2 hours when one of the men stopped mid-swing and let his axe drop to his side. He did not say anything. He simply stood still, facing the hollow, his posture rigid. The other man noticed and followed his gaze. At the far edge of the hollow, perhaps 60 yards distant, something was standing near the base of a massive oak. It was upright, roughly human in shape, but wrong in proportion. The figure was tall, taller than any man either of them had seen, but it stood in a stooped posture, as though its spine curved forward under its own weight. Its arms hung low, nearly reaching its knees, and its hands, if they were hands, appeared oversized, the fingers long and slightly curled. The figure was dark, not clothed in dark fabric, but dark in itself, as though its surface absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The skin, if it was skin, looked rough and mottled, textured in a way that suggested age or weathering. From a distance, it was difficult to tell whether the darkness was natural coloring or the accumulation of dirt and organic matter. The figure stood motionless, facing in their direction, though it was unclear whether it was looking at them or simply oriented toward the space they occupied. Neither man spoke, neither moved. The forest around them was silent. The usual background noise of birds and rustling leaves had disappeared entirely. The only sound was the faint creak of branches swaying in a breeze neither man could feel. The figure remained still for what felt like several minutes, but was likely closer to 30 or 40 seconds. Its posture did not shift. It did not step forward or retreat. It simply occupied the space near the oak, present and undeniable, a shape that should not have been there but was. Then, without any visible movement, it was gone. Not hidden behind the tree. Not withdrawn into the undergrowth. Gone. One moment it was there, distinct against the dark bark of the oak. The next moment the space was empty. The men did not discuss what they had seen. They gathered their tools in silence, moved quickly back toward the main path, and did not look behind them. When they returned to camp that evening, they reported the sighting to their foreman in the same flat, procedural tone they would use to report a damaged saw or a difficult tree. The foreman made a note. The site was marked as closed. No crew was sent back. Word of the sighting spread through the camps within a day. The description was consistent each time it was repeated. Tall, stooped, long arms, dark, near the hollow. The men who heard the account did not question it. They did not ask for clarification or suggest alternative explanations. The description matched something they had already been expecting, even if they had not consciously acknowledged it. Other sightings followed over the next week. A figure seen at dusk near a collapsed pit. A shape glimpsed between trees in the early morning, motionless and watching. Each sighting lasted only moments. The figure never approached. It never vocalized. It simply appeared, remained visible long enough to be clearly seen, and then withdrew or vanished. The consistency of the descriptions was unsettling. Different men, different locations, but the same details. The height, the posture, the darkness, the unnatural stillness. It was not a bear standing on its hind legs. It was not a trick of shadow or a misidentified stump. It was a figure, deliberate in its presence, capable of being seen and choosing when to be seen. The men who witnessed it described a profound sense of being observed, not threatened directly but assessed. The figure did not chase or call out. It did not display aggression. But its presence carried weight, a kind of attention that felt invasive and inescapable. The men felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the openness of the terrain. They felt known. And because the figure had now been seen clearly by multiple crews in multiple locations, it could no longer be dismissed as imagination or exaggeration. It was real. It was present. And it was aware of the men working in the woods. That awareness, more than any physical threat, became the source of the dread that settled over the camps in the days that followed. What made the following weeks unbearable was not violence or confrontation. It was proximity without resolution. The figure continued to appear, but always at a distance, always at the edges of active worksites, never advancing but never fully withdrawing. It established a pattern of presence that the men could not ignore and could not escape. A crew felling oak near a ridgeline would see the figure standing below them in the hollow, motionless among the younger trees. When they moved to a different section of the ridge, the figure would reappear an hour later, still distant, still watching. Another crew working hazel along a stream reported the same experience. The figure observed from across the water, partially obscured by the low branches of a willow, visible enough to be recognized, but too far away for detail. It was never close enough to pose an immediate threat. The distance varied, sometimes 50 yards, sometimes 100, but always far enough that retreat was possible. The men could see it clearly. They could mark its position relative to their own. But they could not approach it, and they had no desire to try. The figure did not hide. It made no effort to conceal itself or move stealthily. It simply stood, often for extended periods, and when it moved, it did so openly, walking with a slow, uneven gait that covered ground more quickly than its pace suggested. The men noticed that it favored certain locations, old oaks with exposed roots, areas where the ground dropped away into hollows or pits, sections of the forest where the canopy was thickest, and the light struggled to reach the forest floor. The repetition was oppressive. Knowing that the figure would appear, that it was tracking the movement of the crews from site to site, created a constant low-level tension that wore on the men more than any single encounter could have. They began to expect it. When entering a new area, they would scan the tree line, searching for the dark shape among the trunks. When the work grew quiet, they would glance up, checking to see if it had arrived. The figure never came closer, but the distance no longer felt like safety. It felt like patience. The men understood, without needing to say it, that the figure was capable of closing the gap if it chose to. The fact that it had not done so yet was not reassuring. It suggested intention. It suggested that the figure was observing, learning, waiting for something the men could not predict. Sleep became difficult. The knowledge that the figure was present in the woods at night, that it moved through the same areas the men would return to in the morning, made rest incomplete. Fires were kept burning, and men took turns staying awake, not as formal sentries, but as a shared unspoken agreement that someone should remain alert. The camps were never attacked. Nothing came close. But the possibility, the awareness that something was out there in the darkness, awake and aware, prevented true rest. Conversations grew shorter. The men spoke only when necessary, and even then, the talk remained focused on immediate tasks. There was no speculation about what the figure wanted or what it might do. That kind of conversation required a level of engagement the men no longer had the energy to sustain. They were tired, not from labor, but from sustained vigilance. The forest had become a place where attention could never fully relax. Foremen began consolidating crews, pulling men from isolated sites and grouping them into larger teams. The official reason was efficiency, a need to complete priority sections before the season ended. But the real reason was safety in numbers. Smaller crews had reported more frequent sightings. Larger groups seemed to experience fewer, or at least less prolonged, encounters. The figure still appeared, but it maintained greater distance when more men were present. The men understood what was happening. They were being managed, not by their supervisors, but by the figure itself. It was dictating where they could work, how long they could stay, and how they moved through the forest. The crews had lost control of their own labor. They were operating according to boundaries set by something they did not understand and could not confront. And the figure continued to watch, present, persistent, patient, waiting at the edges of every site, a constant reminder that the woods were no longer theirs to occupy freely. By the first week of June, the crews were operating according to a set of rules that no one had written down or formally announced. These rules emerged organically, shaped by repeated experience and shared instinct. They were not suggestions. They were conditions of continued work. No one entered the deep hollows after midday. The reasoning was never made explicit, but the pattern was absolute. Morning work in low-lying areas was still possible, though cautious. But as the sun reached its peak and began its descent, crews withdrew to higher ground. The hollows were left empty. Tools were packed early if the work was not finished. No one argued. No one tested the boundary. Solitary tasks were eliminated entirely. Men who had previously worked alone, marking trees or clearing undergrowth ahead of the main crew, were now paired or absorbed into larger groups. Foremen reassigned duties to ensure that no one was isolated for more than a few minutes at a time. The official explanation, when one was offered, was efficiency and safety. But the men understood. Being alone in the woods was no longer acceptable. Camps were relocated to open ground. Sites that had been used for years, tucked into clearings surrounded by dense growth, were abandoned in favor of exposed positions with clear sight lines in all directions. The new camps offered less shelter from wind and rain, but they provided visibility. Nothing could approach without being seen from a distance. The men accepted the discomfort without complaint. Tools were accounted for every evening. Axes, saws, wedges, and hammers were counted, inspected, and stored together in a central location within each camp. The process was methodical and non-negotiable. If a tool could not be found, work stopped until it was located. The crews understood that a missing tool was not just a loss of equipment. It was a sign that something had been in the camp, that the boundary between their space and the surrounding woods had been breached. No one worked near old oaks if they could avoid it. The trees themselves were valuable, their timber dense and sought after, but they had become associated too strongly with the presence of the figure. Crews routed their work around them, even when it meant lower yields or more difficult access to other sections. The foremen noted the avoided areas in their logs but did not challenge the decisions. The losses were acceptable compared to the alternative. Movement through the forest became faster and more direct. The leisurely pace that had characterized earlier months, when men might pause to assess a tree or discuss the best approach to a difficult cut, was gone. Work was completed as quickly as possible. Conversations were brief. Breaks were shortened. The goal was to minimize time spent in the woods, to complete the necessary tasks and return to camp before the light began to fail. No one spoke the figure's name during the day. Black Annie's was mentioned only at night around the fire, and even then sparingly. During daylight hours, the silence around the subject was total. It was as though speaking the name might draw attention, might invite the very presence the men were trying to avoid. The superstition, if it was superstition, was observed universally. These rules were not imposed from above. They were not the result of a meeting or a formal decision. They developed through observation and repetition, each crew discovering the same boundaries independently and then recognizing those boundaries in the behavior of others. The rules became shared knowledge, enforced through collective adherence rather than authority. The effect was a kind of order, but it was not the order the men had known at the start of the season. It was an order built around avoidance, shaped by the presence of something the men could not control or remove. The forest remained a workplace, but it was no longer a neutral space. It had become a territory governed by rules the men had not chosen, rules they followed because the alternative, ignoring them, had consequences no one was willing to face. The work continued, but it continued on terms that were no longer entirely their own. The breaking point came on a humid morning in mid-June. A crew of 6 men was working a section of ash along a slope that descended gradually toward a shallow stream. The site had been judged acceptable. It was open, well lit, and far enough from the deeper hollows that had been placed off limits. The men had been there since dawn, and the work had proceeded without incident. Just after mid-morning, one of the men straightened from his saw and turned toward the slope above them. He did not call out. He simply stopped moving, his attention fixed on something upslope. The others noticed and followed his gaze. The figure was there, not at the usual distance. Not across a hollow or separated by dense growth. It was standing 30 yards away, fully visible, positioned among a cluster of young birch at the top of the slope. It was close enough that details were no longer ambiguous. The men could see the texture of its surface, rough and darkened, mottled with what might have been dirt or dried organic matter. The arms were disproportionately long, hanging past the knees, the hands large and fingers extended slightly, as though relaxed. The head was rounded but slightly elongated, the features indistinct at that distance but clearly present. It was not a silhouette. It was a figure, solid and real, standing among the pale trunks of the birch trees. It was not moving. It was watching. The crew did not speak. One man took a step backward. Another lowered his axe slowly to the ground, not dropping it but setting it down with deliberate care, as though any sudden movement might trigger a response. The figure remained still. Its posture was the same stooped stance they had seen before, but the proximity made it seem larger, more substantial. The men could see the slight rise and fall of its torso, a suggestion of breathing, though the movement was slow and irregular. For a long moment nothing happened. The men stood frozen. The figure watched. The forest around them was silent, the birds and insects gone, the air heavy and still. Then the figure moved, not away, toward them. It took a single step down the slope, its gait awkward and deliberate, one long leg extending forward and planting itself firmly before the other followed. The movement was slow, but it covered more ground than it should have. The distance between the figure and the crew shrank from 30 yards to 25 in that single step. The men broke, not in panic, but in immediate collective retreat. They turned and moved toward the stream, not running but walking quickly, keeping their eyes forward, refusing to look back. Tools were left where they lay. The saws, the axes, the wedges driven into half-split logs, everything was abandoned. They reached the stream and crossed it without hesitation, the water shallow enough to wade through without slowing. On the far side, they climbed the opposite slope and finally stopped, turning to look back at the site they had just left. The figure was still there. It had descended further down the slope and now stood at the edge of the worksite, near the tools the men had left behind. It was not examining the equipment. It was not interacting with anything. It was simply standing there, occupying the space the men had occupied moments before. The distance between them was now more than 100 yards, but it felt insufficient. The men continued moving, putting more ground between themselves and the figure, until they reached a ridgeline that offered a clear view of the surrounding area. They waited there for nearly an hour. The figure did not pursue. It remained at the worksite, standing among the abandoned tools, occasionally shifting its weight, but never moving toward them. Eventually it turned and walked slowly back up the slope, disappearing into the birch trees from which it had first appeared. The crew returned to the main camp and reported what had happened. The foreman listened in silence, made notes, and immediately suspended all work in that section of the forest. A second crew was sent to retrieve the tools the following day, moving in a large group and leaving the site as quickly as possible. They reported that the tools had been moved. The axes and saws had been lined up neatly against a fallen log, arranged in a row, as though displayed. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was missing. But the deliberate arrangement was unmistakable. Word of the incident spread through all the camps within hours. The figure had closed the distance. It had moved toward a crew for the first time. The boundaries the men had been observing, the rules they had developed to manage the threat, were no longer sufficient. The figure had demonstrated that it could, if it chose, reduce the space between itself and the workers to nothing. The decision was made quickly. The affected section of the forest was removed from all schedules. Crews working nearby were reassigned to areas further east, away from the hollows and old oaks, away from the places where the figure had been seen most frequently. The work continued, but the territory available for that work had shrunk considerably. The men understood what had happened. They had been pushed back, not violently, not through force, but pushed nonetheless. The figure had established dominance over a section of the woods, and the men had conceded it. There was no shame in the retreat. There was only the recognition that some spaces could no longer be occupied. The forest had been divided, and the men had accepted the smaller portion. The rest of the summer season proceeded under revised plans. Entire groves were struck from the work schedule without formal explanation. Contracts were adjusted. Timber yields were reduced. The losses were documented in the logs kept by foremen and land agents. But the reasons for those losses were described only in vague terms: difficult terrain, unfavorable conditions, resource depletion. The language was neutral and professional, offering no detail that might raise questions or require elaboration. The men did not return to the hollows. The areas near the old oaks remained untouched. Access paths that led toward those sections were allowed to overgrow, and within a few months they had disappeared back into the undergrowth. The forest reclaimed the spaces the men had abandoned, and no effort was made to slow or reverse that process. Other crews, brought in late in the season and unfamiliar with the events of the spring, asked why certain areas were off limits. They were told simply that the sites had been removed from rotation. When they pressed for reasons, they were met with silence or deflection. The men who had been present during the encounters did not discuss what they had seen. They offered no warnings and no explanations. They allowed the newer workers to draw their own conclusions, knowing that those conclusions would come soon enough if the work brought them close to the avoided areas. The economic impact was absorbed quietly. Landowners accepted the reduced output without complaint, suggesting that they too had some awareness of the situation, even if it was never addressed directly. Contracts for the following year were renegotiated to exclude the affected sections entirely. The woods were effectively partitioned. Some areas remained open for labor, others were left alone. The name Black Annie's appeared in a few of the written reports from that period, mentioned briefly in the context of local concerns or worker superstitions. The references were dismissive in tone, framed as explanations for irrational avoidance rather than acknowledgments of a genuine threat. But the fact that the name appeared at all in official documents was significant. It indicated that the figure had moved beyond oral tradition and into the recorded history of the forest's management. The men who left the forest at the end of the season did not speak publicly about what they had experienced. When asked about their time in the woods, they described the work in practical terms: the trees, the terrain, the weather. They did not mention the sightings or the rules or the sections that had been abandoned. The silence was not secrecy, it was exhaustion. They had spent months managing a fear they could not articulate, and they had no desire to revisit it. A few men refused contracts for the following season, citing personal reasons or opportunities elsewhere. Others returned but requested assignments in different regions, far from the Leicestershire border. The turnover was higher than usual, but not so high as to draw attention. The forest labor continued as it always had, with new crews replacing the old, the work carried forward by men who had not been present during the encounters, and who had learned the boundaries only if they violated them. The woods remained, the hollows remained, and Black Annie's, whether seen or unseen, remained among the old oaks and limestone pits, occupying a territory the men had ceded without a fight. The forest had not driven them out entirely, but it had taught them where they were no longer welcome. Years passed. The forest continued to grow. The old oaks thickened. The hollows deepened as rainwater and time eroded the limestone beneath. The sections that had been abandoned in 1879 remained largely untouched, visited occasionally by hunters or travelers, but never again subjected to organized labor. The trees there grew without management, their canopies closing over the clearings that had once marked active work sites. The men who had been present during the encounters aged and left the profession or passed on. Their stories, when shared, were absorbed into the broader collection of warnings and local lore that surrounded the forest. Black Annie's became a name mentioned in the same breath as dangerous terrain and unpredictable weather, a hazard to be noted and avoided. The specifics of the 1879 encounters faded, but the caution they had produced did not. New crews, working the forest decades later, learned quickly which areas were productive and which were not. They did not need to be told why certain hollows were left alone. The quality of the silence in those places, the absence of bird calls and small animal movement, was information enough. Experienced workers recognized the signs and adjusted their routes accordingly. Younger workers followed the example of their elders, and the avoidance continued, passed from one generation to the next without the need for detailed explanation. Attempts were made periodically to reclaim some of the abandoned sections. Timber prices rose. Demand increased. Land agents reviewed old maps and noted the untapped resources in the avoided groves. Crews were sent in with assurances that previous concerns had been exaggerated or misunderstood, but the work never progressed far. Tools went missing. Men reported the same unnatural silences and the same sense of being watched. The projects were quietly shelved, and the sections returned to their status as unworkable. The forest did not change in response to human presence or absence. It continued according to its own rhythms, indifferent to the boundaries men had drawn across it. The hollows remained deep and dark. The old oaks remained standing, and within those places something remained as well, patient and persistent, occupying spaces that had been conceded without contest. What the men of 1879 had encountered was never explained. No naturalist examined the evidence. No investigation was launched. The reports filed that summer were archived and forgotten, surfacing only when researchers much later sought to understand gaps in timber production records. The sightings were never validated or dismissed. They simply existed as documented events, strange interruptions in an otherwise ordinary season of labor. The lesson, if there was one, was not about the nature of Black Annie's. It was about the limits of human presence in certain spaces. Some areas could be worked, others could not. The difference was not always visible in the terrain or the trees. It was learned through experience, through the accumulation of small warnings and undeniable encounters. And once learned, it was respected. The hollows remain today. The old oaks still stand. Walkers who pass through the area sometimes remark on the quiet, on the way sound seems to fall flat in certain groves, on the feeling of being observed from just beyond the edge of vision. Most move on quickly, following the paths that skirt the deeper sections, paths worn smooth by generations of cautious travelers. Some warnings persist not because they are believed, but because they describe boundaries learned the hard way. And those boundaries once established are rarely challenged twice.